to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie. For those of you who are new to this channel, this is a channel where I read through all of the unread books on my bookshelf until I reach zero. So I have a wrap up today of all the books I read in August and September. I didn't do a wrap up in August because I was in a rush before I went on holidays in September, but also because I was in the longest reading funk that I've had for quite some time as a result of reading The Museum of Innocence by Orhan Pamuk and absolutely hating it. So I've made a video all about that. So if you want to get a sense of how much I hated the book and how much I wanted to DNF it, please check out that video. But so today I'm just going to do a wrap up of the 2 months in one go. And I'll start with what I read in September, because in September I was on holidays in Greece and Turkey. And part of the reason why I wanted to read Orhan Pamuk back in August was because I wanted to sort of get into the mood of reading some Turkish literature. And unfortunately, Orhan Pamuk just did not come through for me. However, while I was in Turkey, though, I did actually pick up some books by local authors. And one of them is Madonna in a Fur Coat by Sabahattin. I don't have a copy of the book to show you because while I was actually on my way back to Australia from my holiday, the friend I was traveling with had run out of reading material. So I lent that book to her and she hasn't given it back yet. So, but I did actually read and finish that book on the trip. And the book is about Raif, a young Turkish man in the 1930s. So he's sort of this dreamy, bookish, romantic character. And he was sent to Berlin to study making soap by his father. And the reason why he went to Berlin was because this was the period in Germany between the First and the Second World War, when the German currency just completely fell off a cliff and it suddenly became very cheap for Turkish people to go and study and work in Germany. So Raif is sent by his family to Germany to try and learn the tricks of the trade of the soap making business. And instead of learning business, he spends all his time reading and wandering around and just soaking up the European culture. And he also really likes art, but he really likes art by the old masters. And he doesn't really like kind of contemporary, more modern art until he goes to this one art exhibition and he sees this self-portrait of a lady, and the reviews called this self-portrait Madonna in a Fur Coat. And he becomes absolutely mesmerized by the lady in the picture. And he returns day after day to this painting until he meets the artist herself, Maria. Now, in contrast to Raif, Maria is this kind of free-spirited and independent young woman, and they have an immediate attraction to each other, and that attraction eventually grows to love. Now, when this book was published, it was not at all well received, and I think it's really important at this point to tell you a little bit about the story of this author and the story of this book, because sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. So Sabahattin Ali was born in 1907, and that was at the end of the kind of the Ottoman period. And he was born in a part of the Ottoman Empire that is now Bulgaria. And he becomes a teacher, and similar to Raif in the book, he goes and studies in Germany, in Potsdam. And Ali's daughter would later confirm that part of the story is actually kind of autobiographical, because he does start seeing a woman called Maria while he was living in Germany. But after his period of living abroad, he comes back to Turkey and he becomes a German teacher. And while he was a teacher, Ali starts getting arrested because he wrote a poem criticizing Ataturk. And to kind of get out of prison and get back into the workforce, he needed to write another poem basically praising the regime. But this kind of in and out of prison situation really doesn't change. Ali becomes quite a prolific writer. He founded and edited a popular weekly journal called Marco Pasha, and he edited a literary journal as well. And he sort of builds a profile as a bit of a dissident writer. So he ends up going in and out of prison a few times in his life. So after Ali was released from prison for the final time, he obviously wasn't feeling safe at that point. and he actually tries to get out of Turkey. He applies for a passport. His application for a passport was then rejected, and he then it appears that he tries to escape Turkey by being people smuggled out in a truck. That's what we think happened, because what really happens is that Ali goes missing and his body was found months later, and the truck driver confesses to basically clubbing him to death, and was sentenced only to a very, very minimal period of time in prison. So it's generally believed, I think, in Turkey that the driver was actually engaged by the Turkish state to assassinate Ali. And so that's kind of this really, really sad and awful story of this kind of dissident writer, and quite a well-known dissident at the time in Turkey. And Madonna in a Fur Coat was published a few years before his death, and it really was not well received and had made really no impression, because unlike Ali's public persona for being quite a political writer, this was a very, very simple love story. And it's really sad and kind of ill-fated. So when the book is published, people are a little bit weirded out by the fact that, you know, someone that they assumed to be quite a politically motivated writer had suddenly written this love story that seems to have no real political message in it. But then something weird happened. So this book gets published in the 1940s. It makes no impression whatsoever. And then it starts to kind of get this slow burn behind it, where it passes from one person to another. And by the time we get to the early 2000s, this book becomes a perennial bestseller in Turkey. And it has remained basically a bestseller in Turkey ever since then. It is now one of only 2 books in the Penguin Classics line that's representing Turkish literature. So I really like Madonna in a Fur Coat. I think some of the criticisms of this book as being sort of a simple little love story is valid, but that's precisely why it's good. It's incredibly heartbreaking and elegant in its simplicity. It tells a story of 2 people who had a connection which grew to something more profound, and they were separated by the circumstances of the day and their background. I also like the fact that, and this is a dynamic that is quite strange for the book, the main male character, Raif, he has a lot of, I wouldn't call them effeminate, but quite kind of qualities that you would generally associate with female characters, while the female character, Maria, has a lot of more masculine traits. And so they have this weird dynamic that challenges a lot of gender conventions. And I think it is because of that even though this is quite a simple love story, it never at any stage feels soppy or too romantic. And 70 years after Ali's death, this remains his best and most well-known work, and you can tell why when you read it. So I really, really like this book. I'm very happy I got it. And I will be, and it's one of those things when people borrow your books that you never get it back, but I will be asking for it back from my friend. So while we're on the topic of Turkish literature, I did get another book while I was in Turkey. So I bought the Madonna in a Fur Coat, and then I also got the Time Regulation Institute by Ahmet, Hamdi, Tanpınar. And I did not know this at the time I bought these books, but Penguin only has 2 books by Turkish authors in its range. So in the modern classics range, it's got this Time Regulation Institute, and then the Madonna in a Fur Coat is in the Penguin Black range. The Time Regulation Institute is, as I understand, I don't know too much about it, but I think it's supposed to be an absurdist novel written as if it were a memoir about the main character, who is Hayri Irdal. This guy establishes a government bureaucracy called the Time Regulation Institute that uses kind of these system of fines to make sure that everyone in Turkey changes their time to Western time. I think that's an explicit reference to kind of the policy by Ataturk at the time, which saw Turkey adopt the Gregorian calendar as opposed to whatever they used before that. So it's an allegory of Turkey's modernization and of kind of the clash between tradition and modernity, East and West, and all that sort of stuff. So it sounds like a really interesting, complex book. It almost sounds slightly Kafkaesque, although I'll have to see, because when you talk about kind of absurdity and bureaucracy, the first thing that I think about is Kafka. So we'll see how we go with this one. So I mentioned before that I lent my copy of Madonna in a Fur Coat to my friend who had run out of reading materials. Actually, this friend and I, we went book shopping while we were in Istanbul, and I found the bookshops in Istanbul so interesting. They actually have quite a few kind of reprint houses that we don't see here. So I've got here, and this is a book that she lent to me because I needed some reading materials while I was on holiday. And it's printed by something called Paper Books, which actually just sounds like a fake publisher, and it just seems like there's a whole lot of very small reprint houses in Turkey printing English books for, you know, the equivalent of $2 or $3, and very, very interesting titles that I never see in the West. And then one of the reasons why I think my friend got this book and then lent it to me is that neither of us, and both of us are voracious readers, neither of us have ever heard of this book, and it is The Rosary by Florence Barclay. Now, I'll just read you the back, because one of the reasons why we bought this book, or she bought this book and I asked for it, is the blurb actually sounds so interesting. So it says, The Rosary by Florence Barclay, first published in 1909, tells the story of Jane Champion and Garth Dalmain. The Honourable Jane is plain, exceedingly frank, and a fiercely loyal friend. In the words of Ms. Barclay, she had once been described by one who saw below the surface as a perfectly beautiful woman in an absolutely plain shell. Garth Dalmain, the artistic and sensitive hero, is blessed in appearance as Jane is not. He is the fun, gifted bachelor that every woman is out to catch. After years of friendship, one night Garth hears Jane sing for the first time, and the veil is lifted. He declares his love to her, but Jane does not believe it will last. Then things got interesting. In digging through these lost novels, it is so much fun to find one like this that is truly engrossing from the first page and as deeply moving as any Bronte or Austen work. Now, how can you not buy this book after that? It's not often that I read romance novels, but it sounded like a really interesting premise. And it was. So I read through this book while I was on holiday in about 3 days. So the first third of this book was just as charming as the blurb promised. There was an eccentric duchess, there was a talking bird, there was a female protagonist who was described as plain, whatever that means, but is actually really, really interesting. She had actual hobbies. She's sporty, she's adventurous, she's interested in other people, she's independent. And so it's quite an interesting premise and a kind of a different protagonist for a book that was published in 1909. And then about a third of the way through this book, something happens and it really turns this book from this kind of chirpy, charming romance novel into a soppy hot mess. Now, I don't want to give it away, but I'm very disappointed by kind of the last third of this book in particular. So the positives are that you never really stop liking the main characters. Even though they do test your patience a little bit towards the end, the book also has a pretty good pace and is very, very readable. As I said, I got through this book in about 3 days, and that was with all the traveling and minimal effort on my part. The negatives are basically the plot, the casual racism towards kind of in its descriptions of Arabs and of Scottish people, of all people, and also in just kind of the weird religious undertones in the book, particularly towards the final end. It gets quite moralistic and preachy, but overall it was a kind of a nice lightweight romance novel, and apparently this book, when it was published, was like the bestseller of the year, and is now considered to be a forgotten classic, but in my view probably deservedly forgotten. So the next book I read, and this is a book that I attempted to read while I was on holidays with very, very mixed success, was Possession by AS Byatt. Now, I've had this book on my bookshelf for a long, long time. And in fact, I used to have the movie version of this book with Gwyneth Paltrow on the front cover. And I was so put off by the front cover that I had to actually replace my existing copy with a different copy. So Possession tells the story of two parallel timelines. So there's the Victorian period and the kind of the modern period, but this book was written, I think, in the 1980s. So what was contemporary to the 1980s. So the present day story follows two literary scholars, Roland and Maud. So Roland, he's sort of down in the dumps. He's a PhD graduate with no job, no prospects, no future. He's poor. He's living off his girlfriend, and his main specialty is this Victorian poet called Randolph Henry Ashe. Roland is reading through one of Ashe's old books, so his actual book that he got out of the archives, and a letter falls out one day, and he looks at the letter and it's written to a female, and the female is not identified in the letter because the letter appears to be a draft that was never sent. And the letter just has this kind of urgency, like, I must see you again. You know, you impressed me so much. So Roland gets very intrigued because he's not known that Ashe has been involved with anyone else. Ashe was at the time a married man. And so he goes down a rabbit hole trying to find out who this woman was that Ashe was writing to. And he figures out that Ashe must have been writing to this other Victorian poet called Christine Lamothe. So Roland was shocked by this because it's not actually known that Ashe and Lamothe actually knew each other in their lifetimes. So he goes to see a scholar who specializes in Lamothe, and that is Maud. Now, Maud is probably what we would call old money chic in 2023. She is stylish, she's cold, she's brilliant. She's actually descended from Lamothe's family, or a branch of that family. And so Roland feels just completely emasculated by her. But they eventually become drawn to each other, and they also become drawn to this quest to find out what actually happened between Ashe and Lamothe. And the story sort of then shuffles between kind of the modern period and also the Victorian period. And I absolutely loved this book. The problem was, however, that it was completely the wrong book to take to a holiday in Greece. So imagine this, I'm in Greece, I'm lying in the sun, I'm surrounded by water that's blue and sparkling, and it's beautiful weather every single day. And this book is just not that vibe. And I'm not much of a mood reader, but this book is all about kind of cold, rainy days in a dusty library, flicking through archives, drinking a hot cup of tea. And it just was not the book that I wanted to read when I'm sunbathing. So I actually made very little progress with it while I was in Greece. And I was really struggling with it until I got on the plane to come back to Australia. And then I smashed through this book because once it got cold enough, and I sort of got into the more kind of thrilling aspects of the book. It's actually a great book. I really, really loved it. And the final epilogue to the book was, I think, essential. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but it would have just been so sad if she hadn't written the final chapter. But highly recommend. I can see why it won the Booker Prize, and it is absolutely perfect for kind of a fall winter kind of vibe reading. Absolutely not for beach reading. Going back in time a little bit, just before I left on my holiday, I had finished Silas Marner by George Eliot. So this is part of my year of reading Victorians, and I wanted to read a second book by George Eliot, and I had the option of, between the unread books on my bookshelf, I had the option of Silas Marner or Mill on the Floss. So I chose Silas Marner because it is probably the shortest Victorian book I own. And it turned out to be really good. So Silas Marner is the story of a weaver. So Silas was previously part of a religious community in a different part of the country, but he was wrongly accused of theft and he was effectively excommunicated. So then he moves to the village where all of this occurs. I think it's called Raveslow or something. And he lives there effectively as a recluse. So he weaves fabric for people, and he makes money, and every day he spends his time counting the pennies, and that is the meaning of his life. But one day, Silas goes out of his house and he comes back and finds that all of his money has been stolen. In place of the stolen money, something else comes into his life. And I won't give away what actually happens because it becomes very obvious otherwise. But the book is quite different to Middlemarch. It has this kind of almost fable-like quality to it. And there is kind of this moral to the story at the very end. And a number of very freakish and dramatic things happen towards the end of the book. But I like the fable-like element to it. It is the thing that keeps you reading. And I said there is a moral to the story, but I think George Eliot treads that line between having a moral to the story versus being moralistic. And I thought that she did it very well. It's not as good as Middlemarch, but not very few books are as good as Middlemarch, but I really, really did enjoy it. And if you are looking for a shorter Victorian book, I do recommend Silas Marner. Now we have to talk about the final book I read during August and September, and that is The Museum of Innocence by Orhan Pamuk. Because after making an entire video about how I wanted to DNF that book and how I hated it, I finished the book. I finished it and I hated it until the bitter end. I basically gave it a bit of a break before I went on holidays. While I was on holiday, because of the very, very long plane ride from Australia to anywhere in the world, I listened to some of it on audiobook. And when I came back from my holiday, I finished the rest of it because I still had the library book. I've now returned the book to the library. So this book, I'm very sad to report, there is no happy ending. I hated this book until the very last page. The characters never become endearing. The relationship never starts to make any sense. And it is just terrible. I don't know how else. I think, so I've already given a synopsis of the book in my previous video, so I'll just link it in the description. I won't repeat it. But effectively, for this book to have worked, you really needed to believe in the love story between the two main characters in the book. And you never do. It's not clear to me what she sees in him, other than maybe money, but that's not love. That's just she loves his money. And it's also not totally clear to me why he becomes so obsessed with her, and everyone in his life refuses to intervene in this really, really unhealthy obsession. And so because of that, the whole relationship dynamic between these two central characters to the book just felt so odd. The ending felt so unnecessary. The whole thing was bizarre, and it's not bizarre in a way that is memorable or profound. It is just bizarre. So unfortunately, I finished the book. I don't know why I don't love myself more. I think I need to get better at DNFing books, ironically, because this was 600 pages of just crap, and I was so bored and I was so resentful. But I'm very happy I read Madonna in a Fur Coat, because that redeemed Turkish literature. I'm looking forward to reading the Time Regulation Institute to redeem Turkish literature even more. But for now, Orhan Pamuk and I are not getting along. So tell me what you think. Have you read any of these books? Have you read much of Turkish literature? If not, please check out Madonna in a Fur Coat, because it is short and sweet, and I think some of you will love it. Now, in terms of my unread bookshelf, we started August with 71 books, and I bought another 2 books in Turkey, Madonna in a Fur Coat and the Time Regulation Institute. So that takes the total number up to 73. For those of you who are new here, I'm not allowed to buy new books until I finished all the books on my unread shelf. That's the point of this channel. But there are a few permitted exceptions, and one of those is when I travel. So I permitted myself to buy 2 more books. So that's 73 books. And during August and September, I read Possession, Silas, Marner, and Madonna in a Fur Coat off my unread shelf. And the rest of the books were either borrowed from my friend or borrowed from the library. So that's 73 minus 3, that is 70. So we finish September slightly in the negative, with 70 books remaining on my bookshelf. I'm hoping to get to at least 65 by the end of the year, and then hopefully 30s by the end of next year. So this is looking more and more like a 3-year project at this stage, but we'll see how we go. I'm not in a rush to get through my entire book list. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you probably very soon.